I forgot to record last week, so I apologize for that. So we're going to jump into our scripture reading. So this is a fairly familiar passage. Many of you have probably read before. Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, verses 13 through 16. Does someone have these few verses they might be willing to read for us this morning? Thank you, Gene.
People were bringing little children to Jesus to have him touch them. But the disciples rebuked them. When Jesus saw this, he was indignant. He said to them, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. I tell you the truth, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter." And he took the children in his arms, put his hands on them, and blessed them.
All right, thank you, Gene. The blessing of the little children. So up on the screen, I've got just like a neoclassical type style painting that we'll look at, a little bit more of the realism style. Jesus holding these little children and the disciples kind of standing in the doorway, looking perplexed, like, why are you doing this, Jesus? So why do the disciples think to keep the children away from Jesus? So what's the reason the disciples gave for wanting to keep the children away from Jesus?
They didn't think the children were important.
They didn't.
They wanted Jesus wasting his time.
Mm-hmm.
Children didn't have a very high value.
Mm-hmm.
One of our earlier cultures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a certain disregard, and you have to also imagine, infant mortality and childhood mortality was fairly high. So, even if you had several children, the chance for all of them to live to adulthood was fairly slim. So the idea for Jesus to waste his time on children where it's like, oh, they might not be followers or disciples anyway. But why does Jesus value the children? They have a faith that's not complicated. Right. They see Jesus for who he is, simple. They don't have to worry about a lot of complicated things, other adults.
Also, he knows from scripture, train up a child the way he should go, and he will not depart from it.
That's right. Train up a child in the way he should go. So Jesus looks at these kids and says, they need to be able to come to me, from an early age. Thank you, Linda. At our
It's interesting, this piece is put right after the divorce piece. Immediately after.
Yeah, that's I was at a Presbytery meeting recently, and one of the speakers was a man named Bruce Reyes Chow. He's a man who was actually moderator of the denomination for a while, 15 or so years ago, and very prolific church planter, evangelist, author. And one of the books he wrote was In Defense of Kindness. And he talks about being kind to people, not being nice to people. It's like being nice means you kind of gloss over problems. You ignore, the problems, and you're just kind of nice and you smile and you might not think it. But being kind means that you see the inherent value of another person and you treat them with dignity and respect because that's how God sees them. And now that type of kindness can lead you to do things that maybe aren't necessarily nice. Or socially proper. And for Jesus, looking at these kids, it's an example of Jesus being kind. He looks at these kids and he sees that God has created them to be divine, or created them to be his children. Like these are God's children, and Jesus sees them as such. So he extends to them this kindness of welcoming them in, rebuking his disciples, turning society upside down. Jesus says, this is why I value the kids, because the kingdom of heaven belongs to people like this. So when we look at Jesus, pointing to the children, saying these are valuable people, these are people that are going to inherit the kingdom possibly ahead of you, suddenly everyone's like, oh my goodness, kids are getting into heaven, and he hasn't said I'm getting into heaven. Maybe I can think long and hard about my values.
Your, last baptism emphasized after that. I don't know I've actually seen you. That was very impressive.
Yeah, thank you. And my last baptism that I did here, Lee Howard Ginther's baby, little Emma. Yeah. All right. So the last question here is, what do you think children think about heaven is different from adults? So put yourself in a 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old, even a 10-year-old child's brain. What does heaven look like to them? That's different from how adults would think about it.
So bright and shiny.
Bright and shiny.
Angel standing on a cloud, like in cartoons.
Angel standing on a cloud, like in
Yes.
cartoons. What did you say, Pat? FAO Schwartz, like a big toy factory, filled with everything they could ever want.
Well, I think the images that we receive at Christmas time, like on the reading card and Easter, it portrays heaven, clouds, light, beaming, sunbeam.
Yeah.
Sunbeam, I wish I were a sunbeam. Why do you want to be a toaster?
Yeah, so you get these images, from greeting card companies about what it should look like with clouds and heaven and God with the big flowy beard, and everyone playing harps. I've said this before, but a mentor of mine back in college who really kind of introduced me to a deeper faith, said that in heaven, whatever it is that brings you most joy doing on earth, that will be your work in heaven. Like there will actually be, because Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden were charged with tending the garden. So there's this idea of, when we get to heaven, we're not just going to lay around like, bumps on a log. There'll be things to do, ways to participate, and activity, which really, I think, yes, consuming is a whole other thing here. All right. So we're going to now move into our week 6 art here. So on the handout, I actually misspelled her name. There should be 2 F's and 1 N. I put 1 F and 2 N's on accident there. So
I've seen it.
you've seen it both ways.
Yeah, I Googled it,
Okay.
and yeah, it's.
All right. So you can do it both ways. I suppose, when you're that famous, you can do whatever you want here. The short version of this is Cornelia, mother of Gracchi, and the CCHI in Italian makes a hard K sound, so it's mother of Gracchi. Pointing to her children as her treasure is the extended title. And her name was Cornelia Gracchus. So when you have the plural form of Gracchus, it becomes Gracchi. So here's a little background about Kauffman. She lived in the late 1700s from 1741 to 1807. She was born to artistic yet modest parents. Her father was a muralist who would go around painting murals like on walls or ceilings, for wealthy patrons, to decorate their palaces and, dining rooms and such like that. So it was mainly around Austria, Germany, down into Italy. So she got a chance to go all around. And her mother was also the speaker of several languages. So as they would travel, she would be the one to kind of help negotiate and deal with a lot of this stuff. So she learned a lot from her mother, being an active participant in her life. And by 12, she had inherited this artistic talent of painting from her father. So she became his apprentice. And at all these different sites, she would be in charge of doing these different things. And eventually the father just kind of ceded sections to her, and she became known in her own right as her own, not just an apprentice to her father, but surpassing him. So by 12, when she would go to these different places and the father was painting the murals, she would do sittings with the bishops and the nobles and paint their portraits and, get a commission from them. So she became fairly famous fairly early on for her artistic ability. She and doing all this stuff with her mother was really instilled with the value of education, of travel, of being able to go to these famous places all around Europe and to be able to talk with artists and thinkers and educators at the time. She was one of the 2 women who helped establish the Royal Academy of Art in England. So, you know, you think of, this was the Royal Academy of Art. They were going to establish precedent for what art should be. This was during the Enlightenment. So it was like, hey, we're going to figure out what is art. They are going to define it, catalog it. And she was invited to be one of the founding members. Her, obviously she still lived in a very patriarchal and condescending culture towards women. You won't find, you know, many women of mediocre or average means. It's like you're either the super elite, like her, like a few of the folks around her time, or, you know, wasn't worth mentioning. So
Go into oblivion.
yes. And she really gained her appreciation for painting while she was in Rome. That was kind of where she felt the most inspiration, the most artistic culture, and she really pulled a lot from Roman heritage, and we'll get into that here in a second. All right. So here's some details about this painting. It's 3.5 feet tall and about 4 feet wide. So you imagine going to the museum, you know, it's about yay big. It's a pretty good size for a painting, but it's certainly not the epic, you know, 14-foot one altarpiece that we had seen that was installed in the church from the Descent of the Cross. And it's just oil painting on canvas. So it's, you know, wood stretched with canvas around it, and they prime it and they sand it and they put it all down. And this type of genre is called a history painting, because it's painting of a historical picture that took place around the year 150 BC back in Rome. So the story of this painting is the woman in the middle, Cornelia. She had several children, but she had 2 sons, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. And they had their sister here, the little girl over here. And a wealthy one comes over to visit Cornelia and says, "Where are your jewels?" To which Cornelia replies, "These are my jewels." And she gestures towards her children, emphasizing the importance of educating and raising her children. So the Kauffman prided herself on her history paintings, yet her portraits and her landscapes ended up being the most popular. So let me just tell you a little bit about the story of this woman, Cornelia. She's the one in the white, the one standing, yeah, the center point. She is the one who, 150 BC, there are lots of things going on in the Roman Empire. You have Roman emperors, you have generals coming and going, you have the conquest of Europe, and power has gotten kind of corrupt. The Senate has gotten kind of corrupt. It's all about cronyism and influencing each other. And these 2 politicians kind of come out, these 2 brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, kind of come out speaking against the corruption and being more of like a common sense, what can we do for the people? And they become champions for the people. They become the ones that speak out against these, you know, senators and, you know, leaders that are kind of corrupting everything. And they gain lots of support, and they kind of build this widespread following. So this cult around the mother kind of pops up, where suddenly you realize that Cornelia is the one who really had instilled her sons with this sense of civic pride, of civic values, and wanting to be a positive member of society and helping to change the culture in which they lived. And the story has actually survived through the millennia. So if you had to take a guess of how many writings we have of female authors from the Roman Empire, how many would you guess we have? So you've heard of all the different, you know, of all the Roman emperors and the histories and the politicians and the, you know, of all of the writings that we have. If you had to say, how many women authors do we have writings from? How many would you guess? None? Tens of thousands? Well, how many do we have evidence for? Tens of thousands of women writers? 4.
Maybe I misunderstood.
Like, how many writings do we have today that were from women authors?
Oh, from then.
From-
I thought you meant of all time.
Oh, no, sorry. Yeah, just from the Roman Empire. Yeah. Yeah, there's 4, Cornelia being one of them. And it's not her original letters that were kept, of course, but there was another male writer at the time who transcribed several of her writings that she had kept, and included them in his larger body of work. So the fact that his larger body of work was kept meant that several of her documents were kept as part of that. And there's good reason to believe that they're as faithful and true as they could be to the original letters, but there's no guarantee. So some people would say there's only 3 female authors because her writings are kind of disputed. But this story captivated lots of people around the time of the Roman Empire because of her 2 sons' rise to power, or their rise to fame for all the good stuff that they were doing. So in this portrait, I know it's really hard to see, but over on the far right, you can see this statue of this face with the helmet. That is the Greek goddess Minerva, or the Roman goddess Minerva. I forget which one it is. But she's the goddess of fighting fighting for just causes. She was originally a goddess of warfare, but not in the vengeful or powerful kind. It's fighting for what is right, fighting for justice, fighting for the people. And then she's also the patron saint, Minerva is, of the arts as well. So there's this sense of creativity as part of that there too. So Kauffman kind of styled herself, this is her own self-portrait, as being of symbol of Minerva, bringing this fighting for the just causes. And then having this painting here of Cornelia, this ancient Roman mother who had these 2 sons, really kind of draws emphasis to the historical aspect of this painting. So here are the 2 boys. I won't go too much into the political careers of them because that's kind of beyond the scope of what we'll talk about. We'll talk about some of the stylistic elements here. But this style, as you might imagine, is called Neoclassic. This painting was done in 1785. By this point, Herculaneum and Pompeii had both recently been excavated. Put yourself in the medieval period. You see these ancient ruins. They're off in a field, they're kind of by themselves, these Roman temples kind of sticking out. And that's a place of ghosts, hauntings, this mythical creature, a land of lore. No one really knew much about them. So for much of the Middle Ages, the ruins were kind of pillaged for stone. They would break them down, they would take the stones, they would build their own cities. By the time you get to the 1700s, they're excavating these Roman ruins. They're excavating Pompeii, they're finding murals, frescoes. They're finding ornately mosaic floors, arches, finely decorated houses, and how the streets were laid out. They found this whole city, and there was this explosion of knowledge and information about how the Romans lived, what they valued. So this time is called Neoclassical because it was met with the same time there was all this renewed revival around the Roman period. So it makes sense then that Kauffman, knowing all this Roman revival stuff was going on, would find this story and want to do a visual depiction of the history story. Not everyone could buy history books at the time, so neoclassical painters would often take these classical subjects and paint them so that way we could have a story of them today. Most people would make like a made-for-TV movie or something like that, or a big blockbuster movie about, you see all these different movies and crowns about these period pieces of like Braveheart or Elizabeth, these, larger than life characters. So these neoclassical painters would take these Roman stories and put them into a painting. The Enlightenment was also getting on in full swing. I don't know if you know what was happening during the middle and late 1700s here on the continent. You might think, this was the forming of the American nation. So, 1776 was when, we had our Declaration of Independence. So there's this proliferation of ideas and values like virtue, honor, democracy. humility, as opposed to being like the pomp and circumstance of kings that would flaunt their wealth, the value of education, temperance. And unfortunately, a lot of this came at the expense of the divine. So no longer was there a lot of mystery in the world. Everything had to be rational, it had to be explained. All this influence on history really kind of called a lot of people to the idea of, okay, well, what were the Roman values that they had? They gave us democracy, they gave us the voting and Senate and all these other different ways for people to govern themselves. And they're living in the area of the Holy Roman Emperor, and you've got the king and the Pope and all these sort of overly top-down heavy rulers in Europe. So these neoclassical Enlightenment folks are really kind of starting to push back against that. And they're starting to say, where is the real value? And unfortunately, the church with a capital C and the divine really start to take a back seat in art as people start to look towards landscapes, portraiture, these history paintings, and we start to see a shifting of values in what can be painted. Also, the art period right before this in the early 1700s was called the Rococo, and it was filled with frivolousness, frivolity. Think of lots of trees and girls in pink petticoats and dalliances in the garden, sort of a thing. There was really a lot kind of going on in high society where the neoclassical painters really sort of said, we need to get away from all this extravagance and all of this pettiness. They saw it had no value. It was really just like a puff piece, No one really wants to think that the most important news of the day is like dog hairstyles, Yes, there's, a time and place for all of that, but that shouldn't be the most important thing. And Kauffman's style for neoclassical painting is a bit softer than other neoclassical. So you think of a lot of stoic, neoclassical, like there's, very statuesque, very harsh architecture. And we'll look at a couple examples of some things to kind of show some examples of that. So I've talked a lot about like the time period and the setting and stuff like that. Are there any questions or comments up to this point of anything I've brought up? Pat, you look like you're thinking of something there.
Well, I have her up on Google, and there's a series of her paintings, and they're all very dark. And the people, but the backgrounds are all very dark. And the author of Wikipedia or whatever this is, says that most of the women that she paints are self-portraits, that she places herself into the scene. But my concern is the darkness, the background. Is that typical of this period?
Yes, yeah. So this is kind of a carryover from Rubens and a typical motif in paintings when they wanted to do something, to do the darker background, made something, whatever's in the foreground is brighter, makes it pop out. And the idea of being a painter to be able to render the lights and the darks just as much as well showed their skill. And when you can get up close in person to one of these paintings and you can look at the dark background, there is lots of detail in there that the painters can still do. But yeah, so it's a matter of showcasing their skill of being able to paint in all the different tones, of having the bright stuff pop out, and to have it be a little bit more still of the stage setting, so that it looks like there are spotlights shining on the main character, so that they kind of pop out.
I wonder if there are modern painters that paint in such detail as these painters.
Yeah, this.
The facial features, the muscles in the legs. I haven't studied any art, but this is amazing to me, the detail. And all of those paintings that you are speaking of. This one.
Yeah, the details in the paintings. And the short answer to your question, like, are there modern painters that do this? Yes, there are people that do. I saw a man who did a portrait of his face that was about 8 feet wide and about 10 or 11 feet tall. And it looked like a photograph. And even if you got right, like you were like 2 feet away looking at the whiskers and the pores on his face, you could see the detail, and it's just, exquisite what people can do with paint. But yeah, these, the draperies, the feet, the sandals, we'll look at some of the details here too. So here's a typical neoclassical painting. Jacques-Louis David is one of the famous neoclassical painters. And here you can see Roman setting, Roman story, very stark. This is a painting of the Oath of the Horatii brothers. This was two cities were warring with each other. So each city said, we will choose 3 warriors to fight with each other. And the winner of the battle, will essentially take the city, so that way the whole city doesn't have to die. But you can see like the bright sort of staging, everyone's kind of lined up, bright spotlight on the front, very highly detailed, very smooth and very sharp lines. And again, if you take a look at the draperies on these guys, the bright blacks and bright white highlights compared to the draperies on the boys, which is a little bit softer, a little bit more muted. Yeah, so there were other neoclassical painters at the time, again, reviving the Roman stories, having these stark paintings, very much of the Roman style. So this is what the Rococo style looked like right before the neoclassical period. So here we have a woman on a swing. This is Jean-Henri Fragonard. This is one of the more famous Rococo paintings. There's a woman on a swing. There's a man in the back. He's pulling the swing. So he's like getting her to swing back and forth. And she's got her leg up and she's kicking off her shoe. And there's a little suitor guy lying down there on the ground whom she's looking at and knows is there as she lifts her leg to him. So this was high art in the early 1700s, lots of pinks. If you think of the little cherubs and, little, naked ladies laying on dolphins, sort of a thing. That's kind of a lot of the painting that was going around at the time. Lots of bushy trees, lots of organic vines crawling everywhere. Everything was very soft and rounded, and there's lots of busyness going on. So when you say this and you say like, okay, what is the value in this? The people said, we need something that is true, something that is honorable, something that gets rid of all of the stuff that isn't there. So instead they come up with, this sort of style. So the neoclassical is very much a reaction against all of this ornate stuff. So when you look at like some of the palaces, you think of like Louis XIV and all of the different ornate windows and all the gold filigree that goes around the ballrooms and the fancy candle stands. That was all came out of this Rococo period. So just to kind of give you a visual sort of timeline of what we've talked about, the Baroque was the dramatic. You had the very black background, you had the dramatic poses, the heavy people, but it was filled with symbolism, right? You had the idea of the cross, of the Eucharist, this church artwork, very heavy-handed, some would say, very over the top when it comes to trying to depict, the dead Jesus coming down, and that's what it was intended to be. So the reaction against that was, let's lighten things up a bit. Let's have fun with art. Let's paint things that aren't necessarily so dour and dire all the time. So the Rococo period really had this explosion of flamboyantness. And then we get to the neoclassical period where it's like, okay, let's get back to what we really want to talk about, which is our values, reviving some of these historical stories that can teach us about what it means to be a virtuous, honorable, noble human being. As opposed to some perv sitting in the bushes, Okay, so here we'll look at some of the details now of the painting here. So here you see the 2 brothers. You can tell they're brothers because they're standing next to each other and the mom's obviously gesturing to them, but the older sibling is holding the younger brother's hand. So there's this sense of the older brother leading the younger, and the younger one's kind of timid. You see him kind of hunched over a little bit like, is it okay to come out? Is it okay to come out? And in his hand, he's holding a little scroll, and on it are written the letters A, B, C. It's kind of really hard to see, but there's a little A, B, C. So you get a sense that he's learning his alphabet, even as he's, 4 and 5 years old, like any, toddler would. And this was unusual. Most kids weren't really taught much until they got a little bit older and they were a little bit more mature. Like we said before, kids weren't really valued all that much, even in the Roman Empire. So they would often not often, but sometimes they would name their kid first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, because that's the number that they were born. And then whenever they grew up, they would just call them, okay, we'll call you, Primo, we'll call you Sextus, we'll call you, whatever your name was. But here you can see the affection of the two brothers. The older brother is looking down on the younger brother as if he's looking out for him. This whole idea of, brotherly love, right? Brothers looking out for each other. That's one of the strong values that was coming about, and especially in the United States at the time, naming Philadelphia the city of brotherly love. So here you have this element of these brothers that are going to look out for each other. They're educating, they're looking out for one another too. You can see a little bit there. And I think as opposed to previous generations, when royalty would study, they would learn Latin and Greek and the biblical languages. Here it says ABC, which are the first three letters of most of the Roman alphabet. So you'd think French, English, all of those would start off with the ABC there instead of the alpha, beta, gamma, delta, or aleph, it's like Hebrew. And so you remember at the base of the cross, when we looked at the descent from the cross, it had Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, written in all those different languages, and the artist kind of showboating, look at all these fancy letters that I can write and all these different letters. Rubens was, kind of doing all this, whereas, Kauffman says, like, look at me, I can write ABC, simple, pure, doesn't need to showcase, again, this idea of humility, of subtleness. We don't need to be ostentatious. And really trying to call people back to what, is really valuable, just teaching the kids. So here's a picture of their feet. You can see the detail of the leather working of the straps of the sandals. Again, the pose that they're in, where they're standing flat on one foot with the other kind of up on the toe and the ball of their foot. He's flat-footed and standing on the toe and the ball of his foot kind of off camera here. Was a very typical Roman pose. So when you would see Roman statues posed, they're always flat on one foot with the other foot raised a little bit. And this was a Roman motif to kind of make it look like they were walking, like the statues were moving. If you think of Egyptian statues, they were always standing like full frontal, both feet very straight and flat. And that gives you a very kind of stoic pose. Whereas if you have them on one foot kind of leaning, it kind of gives a sense of they're moving through space. So both of these boys are painted in a way where it looks like they're moving. They're not seated. She could have painted them sitting at little desks. She could have painted them playing on the floor. She could have painted them, climbing a tree or something like that. But instead, she paints them just simply walking, this very Roman pose, moving through space with the great detail on the sandals there. So this is the woman who's come to show off her jewels. Cornelia, it said that in the 2nd century BC, once her sons were grown, once they were more grown than this, when they were like teenagers and learning their ways, the father died, and she would then continue to entertain visitors who would come to visit with her. She was still fairly well renowned. So visitors and patrons would come and talk, and she would hire tutors to come and tutor her kids. And it became known that she would have such famous people come and teach her kids that she became kind of like a celebrity. So other people would come and want to visit with her, and she would always welcome guests and entertain them. So this is one of her guests who had come, and she was entertaining her guests. And this guest says, "Oh, these are my jewels. Where are your jewels?" And of course, when Cornelia says, rather than running to get her jewel box and compare, how big her earrings were versus how big your earrings were, she says, "These are my treasures, my children." And the look on the woman's face, where she's kind of like, huh? Her mouth's kind of agape, her eyebrows are kind of furrowed, and she has this quizzical look like, "I thought you were this famous, learned mother, fairly, and I ask you, like, where's all your bling, your gold?" And she says, "These are my children." So, the woman's kind of left there, just left hanging, right? Okay. And again, the details on the hair, the gold earrings, the drapery has this wonderful effect to it. But just the look on the woman's face where it's,
You gotta be kidding me.
You got to be kidding me. Your jewels are your kids. And for the time being, this woman, had the moral values of most of the Roman Empire. It's like, those are just your urchins, right? No one really cares much about the kids.
Even the little girl with her has on a necklace.
Yes. So we'll get to here right now. So the little girl down here, people can say, oh, look, the little girl, she wants to play with the jewels. The two boys over on the side, they're the ones that are the noble and righteous ones. And she's the little girl and she's going to play with the jewels. And yes, you might be able to think that, but in some ways, the way the mother is holding the little girl's hand, you can see her arm almost pulling her away from the woman's jewels, saying that those are a temptation of the world. The gold that you seek for isn't the true value that you want, little girl. So it's an allegory in the little girl of, we all think we want the gold, we want the jewels, we want to be pretty. And the mother saying, no, this is not what is the most important thing.
And the little girl's bowing her head off. She said, oh, that makes really nothing to it.
Yeah, she's like, I want to touch it. I really want it. And the mother saying, the little girl is still just a little girl. And there's a sense to say that we're all infants at some point. We all need to learn the ways. We all need to learn how the world works. And Kauffman in this painting is telling people, Cornelia was a model example in her time. Because even as her sons grew up and she would entertain people, she always maintained this model of dignity and of character. And even once her sons were older and actually on the political scene, like making decisions and, making speeches, that she was still a real active part of their lives. So she kind of gained this mythic status. And there are several paintings of Cornelia. If you look at, Cornelia, mother of Gracchi, you can see all sorts of paintings that people have done about her and writings about her over the time. So Kauffman is just one in many series of artists that took this story and painted it out for everyone to see in this way. And again, the background, you can see where's all the, like Fragonard was in the garden with all the trees and the frill. And this, pillar in the background, a solid column, is very simple, very flat. Again, getting rid of all ostentation, just trying to say, we value education, we value our children, we value doing what's right for the people. So in a sense, it's not necessarily a Christian painting, espousing Christian values explicitly, but in a lot of ways, there's a lot of overlap with it. And in this era of painting, as the painting drifts farther away from the church, we'll start to see where people are seeing their motivation and their enlightenment come from. So, yes, Sandy.
Is it possible that the lady was bringing glory to give as a gift? I mean, doesn't seem right that they're just bringing them to brag on. But yes, I own it.
That the story is that when women would come to show their jewels, like that was the way of judging each other, I guess.
No, that wouldn't be hard.
It's like, don't even bother coming over. You just stay home. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. The idea of someone coming over just to brag seems anachronistic to us today. Like no one really does that anymore. Well, people still do that, I suppose. There is still a very big part of us that wants to showcase and showboat, and that's how people get, famous on Instagram, online. You have to have 10,000 likes for your photo, and that way of competing, really kind of can be harmful for folks. And again, all right. Final thoughts, questions, comments before I ask our final question here? Mm-hmm. Yeah, more than meets the eye. It just kind of looks like a nice history painting. So here's the question that I asked that for so long, the answer has been so easy to answer. But for a painting like this, if you were to see it, knowing what you know about the artist and about the story she painted, is this painting sacred? Is it art? How so is it sacred?
Any visual depiction with a God creator creation in it, human or plant or whatever, I feel it's sacred. I mean, you
Yeah.
can consider art too.
Yeah, no, it's a picture of real people, you know, the divine. You see God at work in the world. Okay, that's good. Other questions, Sandy?
Well, I think it shows that her attitude toward the children is similar to the attitude in scripture.
Yeah, it's kind of a stretch, you know, to sort of say she's valuing them the way Jesus values his children, you know. In the Bible story, you have Jesus valuing the children for their innate creativity, or that the God created them as being children of God's, partakers in the kingdom of heaven, a very sacred and divine, you know, experience for Jesus and those children. Whereas here, she's just talking about her kids being members of society, being educated, doing what's right for you know, the good of the nation. You know, that's a little different, or a
It
lot.
does depict virtue.
Oh, hang on a second, Boyd.
It depicts virtue. She is taking the children over the jewels, saying they're more important. I would say that is virtue,
Mhm.
which is
Yeah.
sacred.
Yeah, it's sacred in that the virtue that she has of choosing her children over the jewels. That is certainly a very Christian, you know, value of not wanting to be burdened down by wealth as much, as opposed to the importance of family.
I think you can look at any piece of art, painting or sculpture or music or anything, and you can find sacred. It's the way your mind works.
Yeah, there's, I mean, Les, you know, says, you know, because you can look at anything that anybody created and see it as something sacred, speaks to Genesis 1, when God creates Adam and Eve and says, you know, it is very good that he created them in his image. You know, what does it mean to be in the image of God? And several people have said, well, the only image of God that had been displayed in that first chapter was God creating things. So the fact that we have a creative spirit is the image of God in us. So when we create something, when we participate in creation, whether it be making a sculpture, whether it be creating a piece of furniture or a piece of clothing or creating a song or a dance, when we create something, we are participating in that divine spirit of creation. So in that sense, you know, everything participates in that. All right. Well, thank you all for coming and participating, and thank you, Boyd and Linda, for joining us online.
Thank you very much.
All right. If you have any questions or if anything comes up in the future and you want to ask a question, please feel free to let me know anytime. I'd be more than happy to talk about art and artists and art history and how it relates to the Bible and how we live our lives today. So why don't we go ahead and close with a prayer. Dear God, we thank you for Angelica Kauffman, for the painting that she did. Lord, for holding a mirror up to society, for showing us the values that we place, Lord, on riches and power aren't always the best values. But Lord, that the values that we can place on our family for the betterment of our world, for the betterment of your kingdom, oh God. So Lord, help us to remember what your values are. Help us to remember what you have called us to do. And when we see things in the world, Lord, where we can make a difference, help us to be bold and courageous. Help us to take a stand against the things that are harmful and detrimental, and to stand up for the kindness, Lord, of doing what is right for your people here today. We give you thanks in Jesus' name, and all God's people said together, amen. All right. Have a good morning, everybody.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
I always have to hit the end button like 8 times before my Zoom actually ever ends.